Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am delighted to be joined by Dr. Rakib Ehsan, author of the brand new book, Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. So, ma'am, welcome to the show.
No, thank you for having me, Josh. How you been?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. Like I said, I'd love to have had the book. Oh, here it is. This is the book. Just finished it last night for anyone that wants to get it. I'll put the link in the description below.
Fantastic.
And yeah, as I was saying before we started, I thought it was a fantastic piece of literature and a really, really in-depth look at the way that our political conversation gets sort of race wrong, especially in
Mm.
Britain. So maybe before we start, like go deeper into it, do you want to give people like a thesis of the book or like 60 seconds about what it's about?
No, sure. So in terms of the book, I think one thing I really wanted to achieve with the book, Josh, was challenge what I consider to be quite problematic liberal left narratives surrounding race and identity in the UK. All too often, I think there are doom and gloom narratives when it comes to the description of life for ethnic and racial minorities living in the UK. So one thing I really wanted to do with the book is to inform people that the realities on the ground are far more positive than what they've been told by various elements of the mainstream media, especially the more progressive leaning elements of the media. But the book also challenges right wing conservative commentators in terms of their views on ethnic and racial minorities. And the central point that I really make with the book is that our country, for all its flaws, is a relatively successful multiracial democracy and is a country where you see multiple ethnic and racial minorities now outperforming the white British mainstream on a range of social and economic metrics. So when we're looking at those kind of disparities, Josh, uh, okay, we can have a discussion about racial discrimination, but disparities do not necessarily equal discrimination. There's a variety of social, cultural, and economic factors at play when you're looking at those disparities. And one that I really focus on in the book, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later on, is family structure. So what I want to see is a more effective social policy, which really gets down to the nitty gritty of why certain groups are performing better than others in modern day Britain.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, some of the breakdowns, like you said, we'll get into it, but they were
Mm,
really fascinating to me. So I guess the place that I wanted to start is where people have got this idea from that Britain is this like fundamentally and maybe almost exceptionally racist place, especially compared to Europe and the EU. Like it was
mm,
a big part of the Brexit debate, and some of the stats actually that you quote early in the book, I just wanted to highlight to people were some of the
sure.
majority non-white parts of the country that voted majority to leave the to leave the European Union. So
Mm.
Hounslow voted 63.4% in favor of
Yeah, that's
Brexit.
specifically Osterley and Spring Grove Ward in Hounslow, which
Okay.
has a very sort of notable Indian origin presence.
Okay. Interesting. And then the Luton voted
Indeed, my
56.5%.
hometown.
Yeah. To leave. Slough voted 54.3% to leave, and you quoted a whole bunch of other ones. I don't want to
Mm.
like spend the whole time listing stats, but like, where do you think this idea came from generally that Britain and the Brexit vote was a fundamentally sort of racist endeavor?
No, I think that firstly, there were many mainstream commentators who were utterly shocked by the result. It wasn't what they were expecting at all. Truthfully, I wasn't so surprised, as we've already said, that my hometown of Luton voted to leave the European Union. But I think what we saw in the aftermath of the referendum and EU membership was some very simplistic and, in my view, quite divisive explanations for the result, Josh. Uh, People describing it as a product of white nostalgia. Um, this was the enterprise of bigoted reactionary throwbacks in the provinces, and as you've already alluded to, the picture's far more complex than that. I've made the point that I think one of the driving factors when you look at ethnic minority Euroscepticism, if you can call it that more broadly.
Hmm.
There was that perception that predominantly white Europeans were the beneficiaries of preferential treatment under our immigration system, which was wedded to the EU freedom of movement principle. I also made this point in the book that many first generation migrants coming from the Indian subcontinent, for example, or parts of Africa, they may have a very strong British identity. They may have attachments to their country of origin and also their faith. And faith is also something that I talk about in the book. But there's not really space for that European identity. They weren't socialized under European institutions. It was British institutions. It was ultimately, when it comes to integration, for example, is about being integrated into British civic life, not European civic life. So I think those are the kind of dynamics that I really wanted to highlight in the book. But as you say, I think that many of the explanations for why Brexit took place, you saw journalists based in London looking for these explanations by going to working men's clubs in Northern England or going to pubs in the provincial Midlands. If they wanted to talk to a good number of Brexit voters, they could have just gone to the Mondays and Gurdwaras in West London.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe something that people miss.
Mm,
And what you said about the British, about their sort of attachment to British institutions and British national identity was another thing that I still haven't fully wrapped my head around. Is one of the stats again that you quote is that um, the percentage of people basically that consider their British national identity to be important to them is
mm,
amongst like quote unquote white voters is 63%. Versus non-white voters, which is 68%, meaning that the idea that Brexit was all about sort of white nostalgia is just
mm,
thrown out the window for me. I was just like, what? I actually couldn't quite comprehend that was the case. That there's so many people of minority background that are so
mm,
attached to the British identity, and it's actually quite it makes me quite optimistic for the future of the
mm.
country rather than pessimistic, you know?
No, absolutely. I think there's plenty of reasons to be optimistic about our multiracial democracy, and of course, I wouldn't be the business of looking at my own country through rose-tinted spectacles, and we can talk about some of the problems as well over the course of the conversation. I'm sure
Hmm.
we will. But I think when you look at those figures, non-white versus white, I think there's a variety of factors at play. The reality is there are white British people, for example, they may be more attached to their English identity, their Welsh identity, or their Scottish identity. So their home nation identity, essentially, more than their British identity. That's a possibility. But there is that kind of anti-British metropolitan intellectualism. Intellectualism. I'm really stretching. I'm stretching that term there in that context, where it's just people they have a fundamentally warped view of their own country. People in the white British mainstream, you can call them liberal left, but there are still sensible actors on the liberal left. But what I'm talking about here are people who just, it's almost like they've convinced themselves that, as you said, you described it quite well, this British exceptionalism in terms of being an exceptionally racist society, which is simply not the case. There's a wealth of literature, Josh, which shows that when it comes to having tolerant attitudes towards outgroupers, people maybe of a different ethnic, racial, or religious background, the UK fares pretty well on those kind of indicators, especially compared to a number of countries in the European Union. When it comes to providing anti-discrimination protections, for example, on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and religion, post-Brexit Britain outperforms a string of EU member states: France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, and Italy. So I just don't see this caricature of Britain being a fundamentally racist hellscape. It's simply not rooted in reality, and I suspect that many ethnic minority citizens who live in the UK have a very similar view.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that definitely seems to be the case. And what the thing that I was actually talking to a friend about the other day was that we have Rishi Sunak as our prime minister.
Mm.
I believe he's Punjabi
Yeah,
descendant.
Punjabi Hindu origin, yeah.
Yeah. We had Priti Patel as our Home Secretary. We then had Suella Braverman. We've had Sajid Javid in the Treasury. Um, and I was very proud to be from a country where nobody mentioned the race of these people,
Mm.
just the arguably horrifying policies that they were trying to put into place. But I feel like say if you'd had those characters in
Mm.
America in those positions of power, there would have been a completely different conversation surrounding their background and ethnicity, and that just I didn't see it being discussed at all by anyone. There was nobody saying, "Oh, this is awful." Like everyone was just like, "Well, we don't care. It's about their policies."
No, absolutely. And I think another individual we can mention is the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, as well, of Ghanaian heritage. And I think it really shows how we've progressed as a multiracial democracy, that people either see ethnic minority individuals reaching high positions of public office, the great offices of state. They either see that as a positive development, or to be blunt, Josh, they really don't care. It's more about policy delivery and how they perform in their respective roles. And I think that in that sense, the UK is far more advanced than other European countries. There's still a debate within the Christian Democrats in Germany, for example, in terms of how would they feel if they had a Muslim leader, or if they had multiple Muslims in relatively high positions within the party. Now, I think that the Conservative Party now, I wouldn't say that they've completely sorted out the problem of anti-Muslim prejudice within the party, but I'll definitely say that there's a more accepting attitude within the Conservative Party more generally when it comes to being led by a non-white individual, a non-Christian individual as well, in the case of Rishi Sunak.
Mm.
As you said, you mentioned Sajid Javid. He has a Muslim background. He's had very important roles under this period of Tory-led rule, and I think that it shows that compared to its other centre-right counterparts, the Tory party, for all its flaws, and has many flaws, and I'll talk about that in the book, I think that when it comes to matters of race relations, racial and ethnic representation within the party in relatively high positions, I think that it has progressed much further than many of its centre-right counterparts across much of Europe.
Mm. Yeah, I definitely agree. So one of the things you talk about in the book are the sort of values of faith, family, and
Mm,
flag, which are central have often been central to just British identity generally,
sure.
and is like very central to the lives of a lot of people from minority background. And um, I'm curious as to why those values are seen by at least by I'd say some in the mainstream press as being like white values or like British white values. It strains credulity for me. But why do you think that's become the sort of accepted narrative?
I think in terms of the sort of narrative setting we see on certain elements within the contemporary British left, that there is that focus on racial identity, and there are, in my view, this is myth peddling, Josh. In my view, that if Labour, for example, were to embrace more patriotic expressions, that would alienate racial and ethnic minorities en masse. That's simply not the case, as we've talked about already. The high rates of British identification within racial and ethnic um, minorities, and also within the British Muslim population, which all too often gets portrayed as this disaffected monolithic bloc, which is marginalised in British society. 3 in 4 British Muslims, according to a recent study by Crest Advisory, said that they felt that Britain is a good place to live as a Muslim. And I tell people that, Josh, and they're genuinely shocked by it. And you have to ask why, because that's probably down to much of what's reported about British Muslims more generally by the mainstream media. So, and I think that you look at that traditional triad, which I talk about a great deal in the book, faith, family, and flag. Listen, I'm someone, I have a counter extremism background, and I know full well how religion is exploited and taken advantage of to pursue extremist aims. but I do talk about that maybe it's worth cultivating a shared appreciation of faith, how it can be a source of optimism and resilience in modern day Britain, considering, during the COVID-19 pandemic, when it comes to tackling those challenges in life, that sort of, using faith almost as that source of inspiration and strength, and also how it relates to a sense of community, family values. And there's no harm in the left at least engaging with those points a little bit more. And I talk a great deal about the importance of the family, and I do think that there's in my view quite significant elements of the left. They're obsessed with racial identity when it comes to looking at a range of social and economic outcomes. When I think one of the most important factors when you look at those social and economic factors, or rather those social and economic outcomes, is family structure. What's the kind of culture which is cultivated in the household? What are the main values promoted in the home? I think we need to focus more on that. I'll give you one particular stat which still shocks people, Josh, is that when you're looking at the rate of lone parent households within a particular ethnic group for children aged up to 15 years, for children of Indian origin, it's 6%.
Hmm.
6% live in lone parent households. For their peers of Black Caribbean heritage, it goes all the way up to 63%. That's a remarkable difference. And I think that if there are social justice activists on the left who truly care about young Black lives in modern day Britain, I think they should just talk a little bit more about family stability and the importance of having a responsible male role model that earns money in a proper and legitimate way. How important that kind of figure is in the lives of young lads. I think that's very important and doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah. No, I think you're 100% speaking to something there. So, like, what do you think then is the driving force behind like that sort of disparity? Like, well, what's going on there that's causing this? Yeah, it's 6% versus 63%.
Mm. Now, a lot of people, when they're looking at that 63% figure within Black Caribbean communities, people talk about housing, racial discrimination, especially in the labor market. Now, I wouldn't, now being someone who I traditionally associate myself with the left, I would not trivialize those factors at all. But I'd also make the point that those are also problems, for example, for British Bangladeshis living in the UK. And perhaps they may have the added problem of suffering anti-Muslim prejudice. Most people of Black Caribbean origin are not Muslim. So I think we really need to talk about people's attitudes towards the family, also attitudes towards family building. To what extent do they value marriage as an institution, Josh? I think that's quite important. And what are the cultural attitudes towards out of wedlock births, for example? To what extent would someone be against that, as a value, or rather, how comfortable would they be with that?
Hmm.
And how would a local community perhaps respond to that if someone was to have children outside of marriage? I think there's a variety of cultural factors at play, but one thing we do know is that one of the driving factors behind high rates of lone parent households is out of wedlock births. Because I'm not in the business of romanticizing marriage as an institution, but more times than not, and compared to non-marital arrangements, marriage can be an institution that provides a degree of stability and security, especially for young people as they're growing up.
Mm. Yeah, actually, I got one of the stats you cite in the
Mm,
book here is that 53% of cohabiting parents are likely to break up before the child is 5 years old,
mm,
whereas that drops to 15% when the parents are married, which I think really underlines your point about the stability that it provides. It's and I think it kind of also dismisses some of the ideas that people view marriage as like a frivolous institution these days. It kind of like speaks to the idea that once they've made that kind of
mm,
commitment, however real they may see that as, like, some people think it's like a piece of paper, but it's something
mm.
that clearly like drives people to desire to stay together for whatever reason that might be.
No, absolutely. And I think we have to sort of talk about cultural attitudes towards marriage in terms of how people view it as an institution. For me, there's a great deal of self-sacrifice involved in getting married, and I think that, of course, you want to talk about what do I get out of getting married ultimately, but you also have to think about what would I like to give to my marriage as well, and there has to be. The reality is your degree of individual freedom may well become more restricted in the post marriage world. You could say in your own post marriage life, and I think that that there has to be that understanding that more individualistic mindsets are not necessarily compatible with the maintenance of a healthy and stable marriage. I think that's the truth of it. And I think perhaps in ethnic and racial groups, which maybe have more collectivistic mindsets, and they have that, valuing marriage as an institution, which does require a degree of self sacrifice, perhaps that contributes to higher rates of family stability, lower rates of lone parent households compared to other groups who groups which may be more secularized and may not have those same views on marriage as an institution, or perhaps their view of marriage is more about what they can get out of the marriage. So it's more of an individualistic approach to marriage.
Mm. So the other thing you've mentioned there is faith, which sort of
Mm,
like the marriage and faith tend to be sort of at least somewhat intertwined, given the sort of implications of getting married, like in a church or a mosque or
mm.
wherever it might be. Humanist ceremony, as I was at recently, was very nice. Um,
I'm
so
sure it was.
yeah, it was. Yeah, well, I mean, it's about your friends standing up, together and saying they're going to commit to each other rather than the actual institution in which it's in. I think, and
Mm,
for a lot of people, but um, you kind of talk about the what faith can do for people a lot in the book as well, and sort of how it affects their outlook on life. Like another one of the sort of stats that blew me away in the book is the life satisfaction for people who categorize their faith as very important in their life is 60%, whereas those who would say religion's not important to them drops to 30%. So that's half as many people think like are satisfied with their life without religion in it. And why do you think the discussion surrounding
mm.
this is just not a part of our conversation?
Well, I think that if you're looking at the recent census data, we've become a rapidly secularized society, Josh. There's no two ways about that. I think in 2001, I think over 7 in 10 people identified as Christian. I think now that's gone down to around 46%.
Oh wow.
So it's quite a significant drop. Um, but we've become a more secular society. We've also become a more diverse society. And there have been a growth of particular religious groups, such as Muslims, as a proportion of the wider society. And I do think that there are elements of the left who have an uncomfortable relationship with faith, if truth be told. And I think here it's more about how you connect faith to values, surrounding the family, community, and there's a wealth of literature now which very much shows that compared to people who may not necessarily value their religious identity or they may not be of faith, religious people do tend to be happier. They tend to be happier. They tend to be more satisfied with their life. And those are also factors which are quite important when it comes to being productive in life. As you know, in the country, we've had a real productivity crisis.
Mm.
And I think that we need to look at how faith relates to well being, happiness, life satisfaction, sense of belonging, having a sense of purpose in life as well, because that's very important to live a very productive, fulfilling, and efficient life as well. And ultimately, I'm in the business that we need to be a productive nation. And I think that it's worth at least having that debate in terms of how faith feeds in, how faith relates to well-being, and how that in turn feeds into concepts of economic productivity
Mm.
as well. So I think there's no harm in having that discussion, but I do think that there are many activists on the left. They have a very it's almost a militant secularism in a sense. They have a very uncomfortable relationship with faith, and now, of course, I wouldn't romanticize the role of faith in society, but equally, I think that there's too many people on the left who believe that faith does more harm than good in society, and I would question that.
Mm. Yeah, I had a discussion with Esther Kreku a couple of months ago about religion and sort of its impact upon people. Although we sort of came to the conclusion that people, if they don't have like a typical religion or would define themselves as atheist or agnostic, that
Mm,
something becomes their new god. You know, whether
mm,
it's their political ideology or in on either side of the either side of the spectrum. And I think some of the stats you've cited there suggest that that doesn't give them the same level of life satisfaction, even if they've replaced like faith or religion in their life with
mm,
something that they worship with an equal fervor. And you actually pointed out that this can be like really damaging to trying to build a nation that's like coherent and
mm,
together and sort of like has a set of underlying values that we all share. And
absolutely.
I just wanted to quote you at you. You said radical ideologues, political Islamists, far right nativists, and hard left identitarians thrive in the absence of attachments to shared inclusive identities rooted in nationhood.
Mm,
So, like when we lack these things, it seems that bad actors will sweep in an attempt
mm,
from either side of the political spectrum to subsume
absolutely.
that. You know.
Absolutely, and I make no apologies for promoting a sort of robust form of civic nationalism, and I think you need that in order to tie a diversity of groups together in a modern society such as ours. Now, I'm not saying that every single person has to adopt a particular faith overnight, of course not. But I do think that the sense of the faith, family, and flag, that traditional triad that we were referring to, that we referred to earlier, and I think that when it comes to, for example, talking about a sense of community, that doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to your own racial, ethnic, or religious group. I live in a very diverse local community, and I get along with many people who do not share my racial, ethnic, and religious background. That'd be the case for many friendship groups across my hometown of Luton. It's a very hyper diverse part of the country, and I think that's what I'm referring to really when I talk about that importance of mutual respect, social trust, which cuts across different groups, and I think that all too often we have that there's been an over celebration of difference, and I think that the difference and diversity it should be celebrated only if you have a sort of common moral cultural standard to tie that diversity together. And I think that the one cause that the left cannot give up on is social solidarity. I think it's very important for left wing politics more generally. And I just think that if there's an obsession with tribal identity politics, whether that's based on race, sex, we were seeing radical transgenderism really gain a foothold on the British left. And I think that a real problem here is that there's an importation of a very aggressive racial identity politics from the United States, a relatively youthful experiment, in my view, which is still struggling to get the grips with the legacy of slavery and segregation. And I think that if you want to talk about an anti racist politics, it has to be one that's respectful and understanding of British history and heritage and focuses more on practical action as opposed to importing concepts such as safe spaces, for example, from the United States, which in my view is almost a kind of a form of new age segregation, which I don't want to see in the UK in any way, shape, or form.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always baffled me that we import so many of these political terms and
Mm,
causes from America. Like, I guess it's because sort of culturally we tend to just be like a few years downstream from them, and people will see like positive and negative aspects of things that sort of
Mm.
become huge in America and decide that that's the way forward in Britain because you know everything that happens in America has to happen here 5 years down the line. Um, I wanted to ask though actually because you sort of allude to this in the book a little bit without going deeply into it, and I wanted to get your take. Was one of the things, so you mentioned that one of the things that sort of at least seems that people believe has worsened race relations is this is like a lot of the importation of Black Lives Matter and identity
Mm.
politics. And I feel like that's definitely one aspect of it. But the other thing that I think that we sort of have severely lacked over the past sort of 10 or 15 years, especially basically since 2008 and since the Tories came in 2010, was some of the funding cuts to local services and like
Mm.
local community groups were one of the things that they suffered the most as a result of austerity, and that one of the things that I think we lack now in trying to build communities is the funding for like local sports teams, youth
Mm.
groups, village fairs, like all like town events, things like that sort of got cut back significantly.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that when you look at the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, I didn't really see that as an authentically conservative government. It was more sort of classical liberalism, which was quite hyper individualistic. And I think for me, the big society, it was called the big society, wasn't it? It was more
Yeah.
like a big con, let's be absolutely honest. And I think that the sort of civic associations that you're referring to, sort of local football teams, talking about town hall events as well, um, even things like food festivals, just
Mm.
take that for example. You'll be surprised how effective they are in bringing different people together who may not necessarily have very high rates of social interaction in day-to-day life. And I think for me, if you want that to be sort of healthy fixtures of civic life in a town or in a city or in a village as well, you need to have the structure in place. That just can't that simply can't happen overnight, and then that just becomes sort of stuff that takes place on a weekly basis. It needs to
Mm.
have that initial funding to really get those kind of initiatives going, and I don't think that the coalition government at the time really understood that. They just thought that if we sort of roll back the state in a way and we stop funding for this, that the community will step in, and some communities did try to do that, but I think almost in a way you're exploiting the goodwill of many working class people by doing that, who have to actually take money out of their own pocket or they have to do things for free. Now, of course, volunteering is an activity which should be highly respected in society. But if you're talking about these sorts of initiatives and projects, Josh, that needs funding. And I think that that was one of the things about austerity. I don't think that it was austerity is no friend of community spirit. Put it that way. That much is clear as day. And I think that if you want to have those projects, if you want them to become embedded in society, they have to have a healthy level of initial funding. And then over time, they may become more self sufficient. People become more involved in sustaining those projects. So organically over time, they can be sustained. But for me, I think that austerity more generally, I think it was quite destructive for many working class communities across the country. And I think that more generally, when you're talking about the civic life of local communities, I don't think, and I still don't think the Conservatives really get it. I mean, if
Mm.
truth be told, they don't really. I mean, how often do they really talk about, the sort of making wholesome speeches about family, community, and nation? Of course, we should value policy delivery, but they don't even deliver wholesome speeches on those. On those, those sort of how do you say that, those arenas of belonging, you could say. So I think that the Conservative Party, it looks like they're going to be dumped out of government in the not too distant future. I think it needs a serious period of introspection, and it's something that I talked about in the book. That the Conservative Party, for me, it remains beholden to corporate interests. Um, and that there's still too many free marketeers for my liking in the party. And I think that free market fundamentalism poses a threat to family, community, and nation. And I think we saw that well and truly with Liz Truss's very brief and disastrous spell as Prime Minister.
Yeah, I'm baffled by the fact that she's now back giving speeches
Indeed.
and like claiming that she was right. And I'm like, man, like just the tiniest bit of self-awareness. Just go away for 5 years. Even Theresa May is coming back now, being like, oh, and
Woke and proud.
yeah, and claiming that woke and proud, and just this idea that she was a great prime minister. She wasn't. She was dragged from all sides of her party. She was an ineffective leader. She was indecisive. She couldn't like figure out what the direction. What like there's so many critiques. It
Yeah,
seems,
Josh, for me, I think it's an overcorrection. I mean, this was the lady who organised the go home vans in
yeah,
local neighbourhoods, and
yeah,
now she's woke and proud. And I think, in a way, you have conservatives who they govern in a very controversial way. And I think later on in their career, they seek to overcompensate for that time by now being sort of overly socially liberal in a sense, now saying that they're woke and proud. And yeah, I find it all a bit embarrassing, if truth be told.
yeah. And well, I feel like it's probably closer to what she actually believed the whole time was, and then the way they govern, as you said, is very. It's very dead cat. It's very Linton Crosby. Like here's the wedge issue. This is the. It's like
Yeah.
the Trumpification, or if you want to use that word of politics, where you find the wedge, and it's like, well, you're either like we're going to make this extreme policy, and you're either with us or you're against us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
It's
frustrating.
very divisive way to approach politics.
Yeah, and we see the consequences of it in like the increasing polarization in Britain, and I say the increasing polarization. I think the polarization is mostly on the very loud minorities in Twitter of the
Yeah,
extreme
true.
voices.
That's a good point.
But we still see it happening, and you see it escalated probably by the media, and like it blows me away that, to your point about the Conservative Party, that no one seems to be interested in saying, look, we are one country, or well, four countries, but one
Yeah.
country.
4 home nations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
four home nations, for however long that lasts, but four home nations. And that we share a massive amount of cultural heritage
Absolutely.
and values, and that we should try and build something where everyone can be proud to live in the country that we all exist in. And I just, it blows me away that no one seems to grasp, or at least at the minute no one seems to grasp it, because I wanted to ask you about Keir Starmer. And
Sure.
so, and reading your book, there was a lot of moments where I was just like, is this why he keeps posing with the flag? Like, like, do you think he's the guy to sort of take one of our political parties away from this, like, very identity driven politics?
Can only live in hope, mate. That's the truth of it. I think there is an opportunity for a Labour government, a potential Labour government, to bridge those cultural divides, Josh. Immigration, for example, I think there's many parts of the country who believe that the current levels of immigration are just too high. The last net migration figures, I think it was 606,000, which is unprecedented. But I think that there's a bridge to be made there, in terms of immigration. We want to have a dynamic economy where we are able to address labour market shortages, if they are a matter of urgency.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that more generally, I think over time we can reduce our dependency on immigration by investing more in our own domestic workforce, irrespective of people's race, ethnicity, or faith. And I think that investing in domestic skills, providing high quality apprenticeships, and trying to raise educational standards in local communities. I think we need to in bursaries and scholarships as well, bursaries especially for the NHS and social care. I think we need to move in that direction. I think it'd be very popular with many traditional leftist voters if Labour was to adopt that approach. And I think over time you'd see that the country would wean itself off immigration dependency in particular sectors. And I think the reality is, when you look at agriculture, for example, Josh, that much of the work is absolutely backbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that you're going to get people like you're going to get urban Brits and then maybe bust them into remote agricultural areas to do this backbreaking work, I don't want to see that. So we need to talk about automation. What's the role of AI and nanotechnology in fostering a more efficient and productive agricultural sector, we can have those discussions, and they're important discussions to be had. I think there's issues surrounding race, for example, where we can say, there are improvements to be made in terms of the labour market. People with traditionally English sounding names, if you call it that, they tend to fare better than people with culturally distant names, even when you control for skills, job experience, academic record. So I think that we can talk about, how do we address that? For example, maybe we can expand name blind applications across different sectors. So at least more people with those ethnically or rather culturally distant names who may come from ethnic minority backgrounds, they can at least get to the interview stage at least, so then they can prove themselves in person to a potential employer. I think in terms of health, for example, we have disparities where Black British mothers are 4 times more likely to die at childbirth compared to their white peers. We should at least look into that. We should investigate that, and I'm supportive of that. I think with, in terms of policing, stop and search, as you know, is deeply controversial. I think that at least local police forces, they can engage more with local communities to say, well, actually, this is why we think this is a very useful policing instrument. We're trying to combat this particular form of crime, and we feel that this could be an effective instrument to do that. So in a way, you're cultivating public consent, in a sense, and you're helping to strengthen trust between the police and local communities that they serve. And so I think all those debates are very important. And I think in a way you're helping to bridge cultural divides by taking that kind of approach. So, and I think that a mature social democratic party could be well positioned to bridge those divides. But I think Sir Keir Starmer may well face his internal challenges, but that'll require him to adopt a very robust form of leadership and actually, face up to the reality that there are tribal activists within the left who, I think, in my view, they would undermine the cultivation of a mature social democratic politics for modern Britain.
Yeah, so this sort of brings us nicely to Jeremy Corbyn, because I was personally a big fan. I for a number of reasons, like the one I always say to people is because I asked them what percentage of the MPs in Parliament do they believe are beholden to their donors and to big corporate interests, and the answer is normally like 90%, 95%. I don't know what the actual number is, but that's like the perception that people get, and I'm like, I could tell he wasn't one of them, and that's why I liked him. And I thought that the 2017 manifesto in particular, the economic side of it, in the way he wanted to like actually invest in the country. I was like, Britain needs that. Like our infrastructure is crumbling. I think there's a lot of industries that could benefit from either some form of nationalization, or we have to strip the state out of it and regulate the industry. You got to do one or the other, because at the minute we have some horrible form of this neoliberalism where we have taxpayers funding public services, where it gets shipped out often on a no bid contract to a private corporation. The money shoots offshore. It gets like little bits scraped off by lawyers and accountants and like secretive banking institutions and different shell companies. All by the time it gets to the actual public service, it's a bare bones, stripped back thing compared to what we're paying
Absolutely.
for.
In that sense, we're kindred spirits. There's many things that I see in the British economy that it actually makes me quite sad, if truth be told. I think the railways is an example where the rail fares just keep they keep rising. It's quite eye-watering amounts, and ultimately, it's British citizens who are feeding into the coffers of the Dutch state. Essentially, that is, and I think that you see many examples of that, where the ordinary British people are parting with such large amounts of their own money, and it's going directly into the coffers of the Dutch state or the French state, for example. And I think that, how can our political establishment be so comfortable with that? I find it absolutely shocking. I think with Jeremy Corbyn, there are many of his economic proposals which are actually quite popular. And I think there's a debate to be had in terms of, how do we knock down stubborn class-based barriers. I still don't think we talk about social class enough. on the left. I think that's a common complaint among traditional leftists.
Hmm.
I think the issue with I think the main issue with, I mean, there were many issues with Jeremy Corbyn, and it's something I touched on in the book. I think that, if you're a party that was responsible for bringing in the Equality Act and then you breach that Equality Act on three fronts over complaints of anti-Semitism within your party, I think it really weakens your sort of moral standing from an anti-discrimination point of view. I'm a member of a religious minority, and I do think that I was very concerned about the way complaints surrounding anti-Semitism were handled under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. I think from a more cultural point of view, I remember that Corbyn tweeted once about how Labour were the only party that could be trusted to unlock the talent and potential of ethnic minority people.
Yeah.
And I just found that very patronising. For me, hyper paternalistic nonsense, in my view. I think that if you want to talk about what helps young people to maximise their potential, belonging to a loving and stable home would be right up there. A community that cares about their progress, high quality public services, especially schooling. Um, but ultimately, a lot of that it's ultimately about the kind of home that they live in and the kind of community which they're part of. And I think that I think that really what that showed was that it was a line of thinking which, in my view, was quite patronising and condescending, and it'd be quite alienating for many aspirational and traditional-minded ethnic minority voters. But I think one of the main issues with Corbyn's leadership, I think Brexit, the fudging of Brexit, was a very serious problem. But I think more generally, my biggest complaint really was that he was far too cozy with, in my view, quite questionable activists.
Mm.
Um, so that would be whether it's sort of racial identity politics or religious tribalism. I think that he was far too close to those kind of actors. And I think that if you're going to be if you're going to be a leader of the Labour Party, you want to have a strong emphasis on social cohesion. If you fraternize with questionable activists, whether they may be racial identitarians or Islamists, you're going to run into problems,
Mm.
and people are going to question your ability to keep a society together if you are too cozy with those kind of groups and individuals.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, personally, one of the things that frustrated me was the way he responded to the questions about the IRA.
Mm.
I really don't like getting into the Israel Palestine discussion because I don't know. I just don't know.
Well, Josh, that's a point, right? The amount of energy being put into talking about the and I don't want to trivialize these conflicts and geopolitical tensions, but the amount of um, internal energy within the Labour Party that was focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or tensions between India and Pakistan over territorially disputed Kashmir. I'm sorry, but your average British voter, they're going to think about things far closer to home. It's going to be about, the availability of well-paid jobs, employment security, quality of healthcare, educate standards in schools, sort of antisocial behaviour in
Mm.
their local neighbourhood. Right now, it would be the cost of living crisis, which is affecting many people across the country. So I just think when you look at back then, how those foreign territorial disputes, how much focus there was on them within the Labour Party. I just think many British voters may just came to they came to the conclusion, well, they don't really seem to care much about the bread and butter problems in everyday life.
Mm. Yeah, and yeah, I just didn't get because the problem is looking at it for I don't know, maybe it's different for people who haven't lived through like somewhere
Mm,
that's like a, a state with decades of history of violence
mm,
and conflict and a divided community that I look at the way people in Britain talk about the Northern Ireland conflict, and I'm
mm.
like, you have no idea what you're talking about. So I really try to refrain from
Yeah,
getting like involved in like discussions about,
yeah,
I
and
don't know.
don't get me wrong, that's a very important issue in terms of, because there's still tensions in Northern Ireland which need to be addressed. I know we had the Good Friday Agreement. That was a very important development. But there are still underlying tensions within Northern Ireland. As we know, to my understanding, Stormont is currently not in operation,
No, no,
really.
no.
So I think, and those are important issues. And that, for me, that's more of an important issue than Israel Palestine, because that for me is an issue that's very close to home for us.
Hmm.
And I just think with the India Pakistan tensions over territorially disputed Kashmir, that has the potential to cause significant tensions within South Asian communities, especially in places such as Leicester. We saw last year with the Leicester disorders,
Hmm.
a watershed moment in British community relations. So I think that with the Labour Party, you have to focus on the bread and butter issues that we've talked about, sort of things, cost of living, education, healthcare, housing would be another one as well. We have a housing crisis in many parts. It's a nationwide crisis, let's be honest. There's a report by Centre for Cities that says that we have a backlog in the region of 4 million homes. It's absolutely astonishing. And on top of that, what we really need to do is, what are the kind of values and goals in life that brings people together? And I think that the left should be in the business of talking about that, because actually cohesive communities, they're more likely to be productive. That's the truth of it.
Hmm.
And they're probably more likely to have lower levels of crime as well over time if they strengthen in terms of social trust. I think if you focus on those kind of issues, I think that they'll have a really good chance of winning quite a handsome parliament. They may well win a handsome parliamentary majority anyway, but they'd have a very clear programmatic identity that many British people could buy into.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're definitely right there. So I wanted to bring up this quote. I wanted to get your take on it because it was something that caused a lot of controversy and a lot of sort of reaction on Twitter from people. It was from Eddie Dempsey, the RMT activist, and I think it was in March of this year. Or was it last year? Anyway, he said, too many in the Labour Party have made a calculation that there's a certain section at the top end of the working class in alliance with people they calculate from ethnic minorities and liberals that's enough to get them into power. Whatever you think of people that turn up for those Tommy Robinson demos or other marches like that, the one thing that unites those people, whatever bigotry is going on, is their hatred of the liberal left, and they are right to hate them. I wanted to see what you thought of that quote generally, or if you'd heard it.
Eddie makes a good point, in my opinion. Now, of course, I mean, I wouldn't be in the business of trivializing the level of racism within the English. If English Defence League was established in my hometown of Luton, shortly after the Butchers of Basra demonstrations, and for me, I think the issue here is more about how the left abandoned English identity. I think that's a big point, and I think actually the left could play a very important part in cultivating a civic Englishness, which really celebrates England's heritage, history, and the contributions now that people from a diversity of backgrounds make towards English social, cultural, and economic life. And the reality is, Labour abandoned the St George's flag. I'm sure you remember Emily Thornberry's snobbish tweet in Rochester, of a property which is draped in English flag in St George's flags, and had a white van in the driveway. And I think it really showed you the cultural disconnect in a way between sort of social liberals in the Labour Party who may well represent North London constituencies, and sort of white English families that voted for Labour over generations. And so I think the point that Eddie Dempsey made there is that instead of looking down on those people, maybe engage with their economic and cultural anxieties, have a conversation with them in good faith, and I'm sure that'll be reciprocated. Now, in some cases, it might not be reciprocated. Then you say, fair enough, listen, I've tried my best here, but it's confrontational and adversarial attitude. I don't want any more part of it. But I think the reality is, and England, Labour have got a by-election, which I think they can win in Tamworth. Now, at the moment, they're some way behind the Conservative Party, but there's an opportunity there to really make headway in Middle England. And that Tamworth is very classic, traditional Middle England. And I think just an appreciation of people and voters who actually value their English identity. And valuing your English identity does not make you racist. I'm just going to make that point, loud and clear. I think that would be a major step forwards in a cultural capacity if Labour was to do that.
Yeah, I think it really struck me. So I was back home in Northern Ireland with my girlfriend who's English, and she was stunned at the amount of Union flags everywhere in the Protestant parts of Belfast and Northern Ireland. Like, she was like, I have never seen so many Union flags. And I was like, not like, she's from Sussex, like, it's like English heartlands, like, and she had this weird thing where I think a lot of people, maybe not her specifically, but a lot of people are like almost embarrassed of the flag.
I think embarrassed is a good. I think it's a suitable term to use, and I think that's actually a shame. I remember looking at the celebrations ahead of the coronation of King Charles III in Castledurg, which is a, how do you describe it? It's a Protestant part of Northern Ireland, right, which has a very strong British identity, and I think it's those. Maybe your average English person might have gone there and thought, "Wow, God, it's amazing how the English flag is it's so proudly displayed." And I think for me, obviously, Northern Ireland has its own, very specific context. But I do think one of the things that really holds back Northern Ireland is a continued lack of Catholic Protestant cooperation in various areas of life. I think Northern Ireland is a place which has plenty of potential, and even though we have the Good Friday Agreement, I think Josh, you could probably educate me on this, to be honest. But the school system there is quite segregated along religious lines.
No, it still is.
Now, I know that a lot of parents feel that that's their right, that's their parental right to send their children to those sort of schools which are attached to a specific denomination. But how healthy is that for civic life in Northern Ireland in the future? And I think there's a debate to be had on that. But I think in terms of, we have to talk about British identity and English identity a bit separately, because I think ethnic minorities generally, they gravitate quite strongly towards British identity and symbols of Britishness. But I think that in terms of English identity, I'd make this point. I really do think that the left abandoned the St. George's flag. And unfortunately, his organisations like the EDL almost took ownership over it. And they have to make sure that never happens again.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a lovely place to leave it. I hope that someone can bring the values that you've discussed together and sort of advocate for a left-wing party that is, willing to acknowledge that there's progress still to be made, but that we're in a very strong position as a country in terms of, acceptance and sort of celebration of our own diversity of different, backgrounds of people in this country. I think it's a shame when people think that we are like exceptional in that we reject a lot of these minorities when I think there was that quite ridiculous but also very good HSBC ad where Richard Ayoade was talking about how, like, we drive German, our favorite like footballers come from like South America and Africa, and was talking about all of the bits from the whole world that we celebrate and enjoy here. And I think that was a perfect expression of what Britain could celebrate and hopefully will in the future. So yeah, man, is there anything you want to plug aside from the book beyond Grievance?
No, I mean, I'd like to thank you for having me, Josh. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that your viewers enjoyed it as well. And of course, I hope that they buy the book as well.
Yeah, well, it comes highly recommended. I really, really enjoyed it. So yeah, thanks very much, man.
Thanks for having me.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.